Welcome to the Inspiration Contagion podcast, where we spread inspiration one story at a time. I am your host, Holly Jean Jackson. Each episode spotlights and interviews one transformational leader, their stories, and their advice for how you too can lead yourself and others through inspiration. If you are a visionary seeking to uplevel your leadership skills, then this is the podcast for you. I invite you today to spread inspiration like a contagion. Welcome to the Inspiration Contagion movement. Welcome to episode 17 of the Inspiration Contagion podcast. This week's episode will also be available on YouTube as we are recording the video live as well. This week's guest is Pamela Freund Striplen. Pamela is the artistic director and the founder of the Gold Coast Chamber Players. She's also been creating community through her passion for chamber music for over 30 years. She's the winner of the Arts and Culture Award for the Contra Costa County. She's concertized worldwide with leading artists such as Stock Perlman, Duke Ellington, Ray Charles, and Luciano Pavarotti. My apologies for the pronunciations. That's a tongue twister for the day. She's designed innovative educational programs like Topics in Tempo and has recently founded a new company, Immersive Experiences, or IMX, with an inventor and serial entrepreneur named Jim McGrath. Welcome, Pamela. Lots of exciting things going on.
Thank you so much, Holly. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Yeah. So I wanted to just give you the chance to tell us a bit more about yourself and your background.
Well, as you mentioned, I'm a musician. I play the viola. The viola, for those of you who don't know, it's the most closely related to the human voice. And I love the viola, especially because it plays the harmony often instead of the melody. And even when I was growing up, I always liked to sing the harmony. So I'm a violist and I'm an educator. I've been teaching privately for ever since I left college and beyond, and before that, actually. And I've been told that I'm also an entrepreneur. I was born in New York, but I was raised in California. I was trained in Philadelphia, and I played for many years with the San Francisco Opera Orchestra, and I've performed at the Skywalker Ranch, which is George Lucas's recording studio. And I got to play with John Williams up there for Star Wars. That was really fun. And I've started one of the first chamber music collectives in the United States. And as you mentioned, I'm an educator. I teach at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music and privately. And I just founded this new Silicon Valley startup, IMX.
Wow. We could just spend, hours on that alone. So for all of you that are not as familiar with the music world, that's a very impressive background. And I did not know, I'm also a musician. I had no idea that the viola was actually that close to the voice. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and I once had an experience where I was performing with Joni Mitchell, and I was lucky enough to walk back to my car, and I walked alongside her, and she was just so open to chatting, which was great. And she told me that in the 70s, when she first started recording, they wouldn't use the viola for that very reason, at least maybe in her track, because it competed with the voice. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Wow.
So
Well,
we can
first of all,
credit her. Yeah.
yeah, I love Joni Mitchell, but that's really cool. That makes a lot of sense, though, that it's very similar to the human voice
Yeah.
box.
hmm
Wow. So what was it like working with people like John Williams and Joni Mitchell?
Well, it's always really exciting, especially if you're already a fan. Joni Mitchell is somebody I grew up listening to and had all her albums. And we often, as musicians, we often play with people who are big headliners. Like when I played with Ray Charles, I was in the orchestra that was backing him up, but where I happened to be seated was sort of right next to his piano bench. So I felt like I had maybe the best seat in the house, just sitting there right with him. So I could really feel the energy that he has as a performer, which you don't get the same kind of feeling when you're out in the house and you're listening as an audience member. So I felt pretty privileged to have that experience.
Yeah, that's amazing. I used to play clarinet and I performed with orchestras as well. The closest thing I got to what you've described is performing in Carnegie Hall once, but um,
That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Don't sell yourself short. That's wonderful.
yeah, but that's amazing. I don't know if I could perform next to Ray Charles. That would be just such an amazing experience feeling that energy.
Yeah, yeah. But it's part of, I mean, it's part of actually what most of us are used to when we're performing, because we're often playing with a wide variety of people in different circumstances. Sometimes, like when you go to a recording studio, you don't even know what you're going to play. They just put the music in front of you and you play. And in my early career, I used to substitute for San Francisco Opera, and they would call me up sometimes, 5 o'clock in the afternoon and say, "Can you come in? Somebody's sick. Can you come in and sight read in a performance of an opera?" And that was a little bit scary until I got used to doing it. But it's a challenge, but
Wow.
lots of fun. Lots of fun.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think that's for me. I gave up because of I didn't give up. I realized that for me it wasn't the right path because the pressure was just so extreme. Um, but I love sight reading now for fun, but not in front of, thousands of people. So yay for you,
Right.
Pamela. Yeah. So, Pamela, since we're on the Inspiration Contagion podcast, I wanted to ask you, what makes you an inspirational leader or what's your secret sauce?
Well, I think that's a hard question for anybody to answer about themselves, but I would say probably my energy and enthusiasm, especially for a high quality experience, and that sort of drives everything. I've been called a matchmaker because I put people and music together. So when I design my programming, I not only think about what music goes together, but I also think about who might bring something really special to that. Of course, most musicians are well versed in every style, but some people have a particular bent towards something, and I like to foster that.
I love that. Yeah, combining music for specific people is really a specialized talent to have for sure. That's
Yeah,
wonderful.
I
So,
enjoy it.
yeah. So what does inspiration mean to you, Pamela?
Well, I think inspiration is actually comes from freedom, because if you look around you, there's literally inspiration everywhere, literally at every single thing you look at. And I think for me, just the ability to dream without limits, to even dream without the limits of perceived possible, what is possible. So if we're limited by, well, that can't happen, or that's never been done, or that's too complicated, which maybe I should listen to that one a little bit more because I'm always doing very complicated things. But just, I think inspiration comes from just curiosity and fearlessness to try.
I love that. And I feel like today we probably need to hear more doses of that than ever because, like you said, the naysayers, the Debbie Downers, the people that say it's impossible. I agree. There is inspiration everywhere if you're willing to be present and open to it. Do you have a tip for people so that they can kind of get back to that place of feeling inspired when they may feel they're challenged right now?
Oh, that's a great question. I think if you go back to yourself, like to your happy place in yourself, like what were you doing when you were really happy, or when you felt very free, or also when you felt really alive? because there's lots of things, for instance, in what I do, which I could just do that all the time. This, whatever this is, maybe we'll talk a little bit about those things later. But there are other things that make me feel tired. Like, oh, that's just and for other people, it wouldn't be like that. So I would say, just go back to a point in your past, very personal, not what works for somebody else, because those, I don't think that really is as effective. You really have to find what really gets you excited. And even if you think, well, yeah, okay, I was excited when I made a great dinner for my husband. Well, you might say, well, how can I use that professionally, let's say, if I'm not going to be a chef? But you can use what motivated you. Why did you like it? Oh, I combined flavors, and I loved his reaction. I loved setting the table. I mean, that's a very sort of banal example. But if you go and you find something that excited you or that had a good result, made you feel good, you can find the elements that you can draw from for something else.
I love that. I think it's so important that we use the times where it's most challenging to go within for the answers. And like you said,
Yeah.
inspiration is so unique and individual. So there could be one person who loves baseball and they're super inspired by everything related to baseball. There could be somebody who's really inspired by music, and specifically maybe it's jazz only, right? So they love jazz, they're obsessed with everything, the history, etc.
Yeah.
And then you talk to somebody else and they're like completely bored. They're like, I have no idea why you find that interesting.
Yeah.
So, like Pamela said, dig deep and just sit with yourself and remember those moments when you're most inspired, most happy, most excited, and most alive. And then start connecting the dots across those to see if there are specific skills or things that you could use, like she was sharing professionally. I love that, Pamela.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. So Pamela, how do you define success for yourself and how did you arrive at that definition?
Well, to be honest, I don't really think much about success. It's sort of a byproduct of what you're doing. So if I had to define it, I would say I define it more in terms of creativity and artistry attempted and the response of others to those things. So I feel, I mean, I've done performances that I was extremely well paid for that were not particularly satisfying. I've done other things for free that make me feel alive and happy just to be able to be human and a musician. So I think it's really a combination of feeling that what you've attempted is successful and that others are responding well to it. So financial success is just a byproduct of these things, not really what drives me.
Yeah, and that's interesting that that's how we perceive that question. So I'm curious, instead of how you define success, how would you define a life well lived, and how did you arrive at that definition?
Oh, that resonates a little more with me. Um, I think it actually goes back to what we were talking about with inspiration, just being curious always. I'm not at the beginning of my career. Hopefully, I'm not also at the end of my career, but I've had a lot of different turns along the way, and just finding, not just for my career but my personal life, finding ways to be to find what's really exciting and good about where you are. And if it's really not a happy place, then you have to really find out what isn't working. Where is the problem? And then just move towards something different.
I like that. The really being in the moment and
Hmm.
reflecting on what you're grateful for, what's working well.
Yeah.
And if, like you just said, you're not happy and it's a difficult time, exploring and maybe experimenting with why it's not working and trying something new.
Right. And I found, like, for myself, I've had full-time employment as a musician, and I've also been a freelancer. And I found that with freelancing, for instance, It was very exciting because of the variety, but I also found it not very satisfying because it was sort of fleeting, and it didn't some of those fleeting experiences were better than others, but I find that it was not a good fit for me, plus all the driving that you have to do as a freelancer. I don't know, I so respect the people who do that because it's very challenging, just the commute, and that's something we're learning during COVID about how that has changed. We're not driving, right? Most of us anyway.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, so I think tuning into what works well for you and experimenting with that is really an important part of living a life really well.
Yeah.
So, Pamela, what are some of the challenges or obstacles that you faced along your journey to living this life where you're really
Yeah.
present and inspired and fulfilled?
Well, I'd say one of the biggest challenges was sort of stepping off the stage and into the behind the scenes without any business training whatsoever. And that has been that's that's been a challenge, and currently is still a challenge. So I created one of the first chamber music collectives, and there was no model for it, and so I had to figure out, well, how does this work, and what a chamber music collective really is. We have what we call fixed ensembles, which is a full-time group that plays together all the same with the same time with the same people. And then we have sort of pickup ensembles, which is ever changing. But what if you have what I have, which is I have sort of a roster of people that I really respect and enjoy performing with, and I think bring a lot of creativity to a project, but they're not in every project. So how do I create? There's no model. I never, when I applied for a grant, I never knew what category to be in. And I would say that's actually, even I'm just realizing now, sort of a running theme in my life. Even when you asked me, am I a storyteller? Well, yeah, I'm a storyteller. That's the best fit. But I say I'm hard to categorize my interests. So in terms of challenges, I would say also another challenge is in what I'm trying to do, which is to create an absolutely world-class concert experience in a small bedroom community. And sometimes there's the perception, because it's sort of community based in a way, and community focused, because we do a lot in the community. We go into the schools, we donate everywhere we can, both our talents and our tickets and whatever, in any way we can. But sometimes it's perceived as for people who haven't been, as it may be less professional because it's in the community. It's sort of that grass is always greener on the other side. So if we were in New York coming to Lafayette, people would say, wow, they're coming from New York or whatever. But actually, a lot of the musicians are coming from all over. In fact, Italy, from Holland, from Germany, from the UK, all over the US. But they're coming to Lafayette. So sometimes there's this strange mix of trying to, I really don't like the status of seeming like it's elite, and that's another the problem to solve, is how to be approachable without being without an amateur status, I would say. So I think those are challenges that I'm constantly thinking about. But the lack of business training, I know music schools are now offering courses in music, which in business, for musicians, and that's so needed. And now particularly, I'm having to once again reinvent my business. So I feel in a way uniquely qualified because I've always been doing that. But it's a huge challenge for everybody. everybody is struggling right now because of the pandemic. I'm sure you're aware that they're saying that the very last things to open up again will be concerts and sporting events.
Yeah, it's
So,
definitely really hard for musicians and live events, and I know we're all really craving those community events.
absolutely.
Yeah, those are really unique challenges. I never really thought about when I was originally studying music performance that they did not teach anything around business, which you definitely need if you're going to become a musician because you're creating your own career, typically doing freelance or the very small percentage of individuals that make it to a symphony or professional orchestra, but the rest they're doing, they're teaching or they're creating their own business. And so it
Right.
should be like a music performance entrepreneurial degree. So I never thought about that until we just had this conversation.
Oh yeah, and it's sorely needed. It was needed before, but now it's really crucial. So I would have certainly benefited from going to business school, or at least having a really healthy dose of it. I was quite resistant to that, and I think actually a lot of artists are, because we feel that because we're so talented and because we've worked so hard to get to a certain level as performers, that should be enough. It will be recognized that it will follow that if you work hard, you have good training, you're gifted enough to foster all those skills, that you'll get a job, or that you'll hit the big time, or you'll be playing in Carnegie Hall, which you're lucky to have done. That's great. I've been there as well. So it's kind of, I think that I don't know, I think it's really a disservice to musicians, because there are a lot of talented people who come out of music school that don't have the first idea of what to do now.
Well, and I think also to your point, all that talent, all of that time invested in becoming the top 1 to 10%, you you're underserved by not having that business experience because you're not understanding what you can negotiate.
Yeah,
Making sure that you're representing yourself for the best contract.
yeah.
I think that ultimately we should probably have business training in all education systems because it's really relevant to everything in life, right?
It certainly is. It certainly is. But I
Yeah.
think maybe artists are most resistant to it, because it seems it may be changing now, but it seems I haven't quite cracked the code of why, but we seem pretty unwilling often to think that it won't just follow. And certainly, my generation of musicians was in that camp. That if you're good, you'll get the career you're looking for.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think that most artists, regardless of the field that they're in, are very resistant. A lot of my clients are people that are graphics designers, artists of some sort. I don't have a musician yet, but who knows if there's a musician out there that's looking to grow your. I'm just kidding. So my point is that yes,
Yeah,
there is a theme around artists being more resistant to business. So
yeah,
yeah,
yep,
it's a
absolutely.
disservice. So Pamela, is there a story of inspiration that you're known for or one that you just want to share?
Well, probably I there are probably two things I would say. The first would be leading new directions in classical music and education. And also, I think this new company that I'm founding, or I have founded, IMX, is a really good example of the inspiration I might be known for. And that came, the idea of immersive experiences came out of a desire to go deeper into a concert experience. So I've always been interested in programming. I think that's why some article that was written called me a matchmaker. So I like themed programs. I've always done that. But IMX is more than a theme. It's a deep dive for all five senses. Um, and I think now that we're so often on Zoom, and we're there right now, one thing I've noticed is that one thing that Zoom actually is giving us that we didn't have before, a lot of people are talking about what's gone. You know, the live experience is forever changed. But actually, I think that with Zoom, we feel the audience completely differently. The obvious miss is the applause. We don't get that applause. We don't get the joy of giving that applause as audience members. And as performers, we don't get the joy of receiving that. However, what we do get as an audience is we get to see each other and really feel each other in a much more focused way than we did before. If you go to a concert, you might see one or two people you know. You'd probably leave without remembering, oh, I saw this person, whatever. But on Zoom, we're actually a unique community. And so that's one of the things IMX is addressing is how can we come together as a unique one night community? This community can be global, right? It can be people from all over the world. So it's a new way to experience and create community.
Yeah, I love that. And I like that you're focusing on how everybody seems really focused on how Zoom is not working. But I agree. You know, like there's some silver lining here. You do have in some ways deeper connections because you're able to actually, chat on the side with individuals while you're in an experience. Or like you
Right.
said, because of what you're doing, you're building these immersive experiences even through Zoom. In fact, I believe that you recently did something like this in Lafayette, correct?
Oh, yes, we just finished our fourth pilot. It was lots of fun. It happened to be on my birthday, so I got to go to Paris on my birthday, which was really
Aw.
fun. It was
Happy
just,
birthday.
oh, thank you. Thank you. And it's been really successful. People are really craving some kind of experience that is not just a substitute, but is actually a new kind of experience. And I hesitate to use the word novel just because we hear it a lot associated with the word COVID. So yeah, so I'm not going to be, although I just said it, didn't I?
That's pretty funny though.
Yeah. But I think that it leads perfectly into this concept of what we were just talking about. Instead of just bemoaning the fact that we don't have the same thing that we had before. Well, we have to get over that because it's different now. And I can't tell you how much I wish I were on stage performing for our audience. It brings me indescribable pleasure and joy. I can't do that. So I could sit around all day talking about that or playing alone in my studio, which is fine for to a point, but I like to play with others. So actually thinking about what does this situation afford that we didn't have before. And that's exactly one of the things that it affords, which is that you can connect. Like, I didn't have to drive anywhere to see you. I'm sitting in my comfy chair in my living room. It's very nice. So I think that looking at ways to utilize current technology, and we're hoping to bring like virtual reality, augmented reality into it. But that's down the line. It's already sort of complicated because we have these three different phases of each immersive experience. There's the anticipation phase where we send out lots of materials to give you interesting information. For instance, we have a musicologist that has done what we call, his name is Kai Christensen. He has a Kai Pod. So it's like a little podcast that he's done. So you can listen to that once or twice or three times. He's very enthusiastic and fun to listen to. And he describes in detail all the music that you're going to hear and he plays little snippets. So you can really become familiar with what you're going to hear at the concert. I also have asked the musicians to do a travel log, so which has become sort of an interesting historic documentation during the pandemic, because the musicians will take their iPhones and go around in their community where they're allowed and show us what it's like during the pandemic. It's very casual, very informal. Our third event was live streamed from Bologna, Italy. And so it was really amazing. So they took us into the deli and we saw the prosciutto hanging and they were cutting cheese and it was amazing. And everybody was masked and it was, I think it's a really fun to see musicians relaxed in their environment. It makes them more real. It gives you a feeling that you've known them. And then, of course, after the concert, you get to talk to them because they're around and we're chatting because they're just in their living room and you're just in your living room. So it's like a big party in a very different way. So those are just a few of the ways that we embrace this new reality rather than try to fight against it or try to create some kind of flat substitute.
Yeah, I love that. It's interesting you bring that up, like showing that musicians are also humans and they're real and like they're authentic in their own environment because sometimes when you look at somebody who's really made it, right? So-called made it, you kind of put them on a pedestal just
Yep.
subconsciously. And so you would never think to ask them questions or approach them. And even my piano teacher in Southern California, Josh Nelson, he's amazing. And he's been doing Facebook Lives and he's so in his own element. He's a completely different human on his Facebook Lives than when you see him perform. And so it's really kind of cool and I think
Yeah.
more intimate in some
Hmm.
ways when you have these experiences where people are not in their typical environment when they're
Right.
doing performances.
That's right. And even, look at Dr. Fauci. You get to see him in his home giving these big medical press conferences. And I find it actually that's caused me to think a lot about image, especially in classical music, because, for instance, when I perform, I wear a gown. For all our chamber music concerts. And it's really fun. I love to dress up. And the audience is looking at you for 2 hours and you want them to have something to look at. But at the same time, you don't want it to be distracting. That's an interesting balance. But then you realize that it's so nice for people to say, hey, there she is at the grocery store, or I didn't know that they worked out at the same gym as I do. I think it's a good lesson that we can both be at the pinnacle of our profession, but we can also be your neighbor. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's actually what I was describing earlier about the finding the balance between the high level professional and the community, because everybody lives somewhere, right?
Right.
Not everybody lives in a penthouse in Manhattan where you might not run into them so readily. So I think it's actually a really great opportunity to think about image.
Well, and it's interesting. This is going to be a pun intended moment, but the coronavirus is in a lot of ways forcing us to remove the mask layers that we wear, right? So
Yes.
even if they're not something we're intentionally choosing to wear, society, like with orchestra and musical performances, I still have my black gowns because they're really expensive and nice in my
Yes.
closet, right?
Mhm.
When I go to the opera, I wear that black gown.
Uh,
And so there are these facades or outfits or images that we put on because they're expected in society, they're required. And so I think the virus, in a lot of ways, is forcing us or allowing us to remove those layers and those masks.
yeah. Yeah. And I think at the same time, and I think that's a really good point, and I would agree with that. At the same time, I think there is value to if since we're just talking about dress, it'll be a nice metaphor for it in other areas. But I think it's fun to be out of your sweats at least part of the day. I think that actually what I've noted from my friends in any case is that early on in the pandemic, nobody was out of their sweats. I mean, it was pretty much either pajamas or sweatpants all day long. And then it sort of bred this feeling. It was good for relaxation and comfort, but it was also lacking in, it's fun to dress up. It's even if you're not really into dressing up, it's the variety, and it's the getting yourself ready to engage. And when you're just alone in your house, as some people are, it's really challenging to find that impetus to get dressed up. So I don't know.
Yeah, it's a balance, right? So I feel like there's somebody I spoke to maybe a couple months into this, and her tips for working from home during especially the virus, because we're so much more distant and people are not used to working from home.
Yeah,
Well, first of all, I never really wore pajamas because I was on so many virtual summits and
yeah,
supporting the chamber that like that never was an option, maybe below, but not up top, right? For all these
exactly.
calls. But what she recommended was, like you were saying, this getting ready and not losing routine too much. Instead of commuting to work, she would walk outside with a mask on or socially distanced. And that was her commute to work for maybe 5 to 20 minutes, listening to a podcast or a book on CD, so that it felt like the habit was still there, the routine was still there. She's still getting the enjoyment of how she spent that time. And
Uh-huh.
then she was able to arrive in her office.
Yeah,
So, one little tip
right.
out there for that. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. That's a great idea. I might try that.
Yeah, add your pandemic commute to work by doing your normal routine and just walking outside, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Exactly.
Pamela, when we first spoke, you identified as a storyteller leader. So, I wanted to ask you a few questions around that. The first one is, do you believe that using stories to inspire and lead is important?
I do. I think it's again a way to break down barriers with people. If you think about fables, we tell fables when to our kids, we read stories. So that's a very kind of intimate experience, but it's also a way of connecting with the listener. And so when you tell a story, like a TED Talk, for instance, I love TED Talks. They're
Me
so
too.
fascinating. Yeah, so many different interesting people. I've noted that a lot of times there'll be a story right up front, and right away you engage with that person as a human, not as a thought leader, not as this famous person, not as this person, boy, I could never be that person. But all of a sudden they become human. And I think that that's one way that you can break down a barrier, is you tell a story to illustrate a point. And even if that story is completely unrelated to the person you're telling it to. For instance, if I told a story about some experience that I had in the classical world, you might not quite get it exactly, but you would say, "Oh, I remember when that sort of something like that happened to me," and immediately there's a connection. So I like to tell stories. Yeah.
I love that. That's great. Those are great examples. Yeah, I feel that that's probably one of the best answers I've heard around that, because stories immediately break down those walls and those barriers that are subconsciously or consciously created between us and others, and allow us to connect human to human. And right now, people are craving that connection more than ever.
Yeah.
So I imagine your experiences that you're creating in your startup have a lot of stories.
Oh yes, they do. They do. And yeah, there's one thing I wanted to add before we move into that. That we have an educational program called Topics in Tempo, and the reason I wanted to bring that up now is that we Topics in Tempo uses music, classical music, as a tool to teach academics. And so, one of those components for the language arts, we teach science, math, social studies, and language arts, and we tie it all together with music in a fifth program. fifth day program. So it's a 5 day program. But the language arts program relates to what we're talking about because we take this piece of music, and classical music is very abstract. It's a challenge for a lot of people to even begin to listen to it. Like, that's kind of pretty, or I don't like that, or why is it so long? And those kinds of things are very common, I think. And so what we do is we have the children, and I do this with adults, really, it's really successful, create a story. It's completely made up. There's no right answer, there's no agenda on our part. You just have characters, you have a plot, you have a setting, you have a conflict, and you have a resolution. And you try to weave it like the music becomes a soundtrack to a movie. And so that engages the student immediately because they're listening to it and they're trying to say, well, what does that sound like? So they're using their own creativity and their own imaginations to get into something that's quite abstract. And then in subsequent lessons, we have them conducting, they're math maestros, and they learn about subdivision. And in science, we have them create an instrument. And social studies, they become composers. And that's my favorite lesson. But anyway, that's part of the, I think, storytelling is literally everywhere. I think we're all storytellers, and music, it's certainly a form of storytelling.
I love how you're demystifying the abstractness of music by having students use stories and to figure out, oh, well, here's a conflict moment. This is the kind of music that I think would be best for that. And then that also creates that experience, right?
Yeah,
Where they're in it with you and they're creating with you in a way that's not so daunting or scary.
yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
find that works with adults as well.
Yes, I'm sure it does.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, it's just funny when you're saying classical music is abstract. I guess it depends on who you're talking to. But for me, I studied music theory for 4 years. And so for me, I'm like, it's not abstract. But for other people, I'm sure it is.
Well, I think it's hard to, I mean, it is just like a pop music, not at all abstract. Usually has a real formula to the chord progression. It's short. But classical music really different. And of course, you and I, both being musicians, we understand that. But to someone without that background, it can be really, especially if you didn't grow up with it. It's hard to get in there, and so that's what we work really hard to do.
I love that. And I
Yeah.
love, I felt like for so long that music should be taught alongside, especially science and math, because it just makes sense, especially when you
Yes.
deeply study it. And like they've proven scientifically that, classical music helps the brain form and all of that. So, like, that's
Yeah.
so cool you have a program on that. I love
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
So, Pamela, what are some of the key transformational stories or stories that have stuck with you that have inspired you the most?
Um, One of the stories I would say that has inspired me the most is something I looked into in 2011. Um, I, I don't know. I don't really have a favorite composer, but if I had to choose, it would be Antonín Dvořák, who is a Czech composer from Bohemia, and I his music just really resonates with me, and so I'm always programming in my concert series something by Dvořák, and I wanted to do that again. So I was looking into, I knew that he had been in America for a few years in the late 1800s. Didn't really know why. I knew that people in music school, I remember hearing that he was in that little Czech community, Spillville, Iowa. I wasn't really sure why. And I knew there was something in the New World Symphony in the I think it's the third movement with a big English horn solo that sounds like a Negro spiritual, but I didn't really know much about that. So I started digging into more about the relationship of Dvorak, his time in America. And I I mean, it's not a unique story. There are others who have discovered it too, but it is not widely known in classical music. And I remember being quite shocked by that. And it's particularly relevant right now with what's been going on in the communities and our societies addressing, especially in the U.S., of people of color. And so I found out about someone who I didn't know about, Harry Burleigh, who was a young African American man. His grandfather was a slave, and he used to go around with his grandfather, and they would sing the slave songs together. Harry's mother was a maid, although she was multilingual, very educated, but she couldn't get any other kind of work. Anyway, she was a housekeeper for a family in Erie, Pennsylvania. And I'm going to make this a very short story because it's actually quite a fascinating story. And Harry used to tag along because at this family's home, they would have these soirees, these musical soirees, where classical musicians would come and they would play, and Harry just loved it. Okay, so fast forward to he finds out about the American University, the American Conservatory of Music in New York, and that they were giving away scholarships to blacks and to women. This is the late 1800s. It was very unusual. Jeanette Thurber was the founder. Fascinating. Wow. So he makes his way, which was really hard, all the way to audition. He makes the audition. He doesn't get in. He's heartbroken. He goes to the registrar's office. He goes in there, and who's in the office but this woman that he saw at one of these soirees in Erie, Pennsylvania? And she intervenes on his behalf. He gets in. So that's really cool right there. But then the most interesting thing happens, which is that Dvorak needs someone to help him with copying. So he hires Harry Burleigh to copy for him, to write out some of the music that he's composing, with the understanding that Harry will sing to him every day these slave songs. So here is a young African American man directly influencing Antonin Dvorak daily. Never heard about that. Never heard about that. So that was the beginning of a decade of investigation, and I did a project in 2011 called Harmony and Melody where we explored that, and I told the story. And next year for Gold Coast Chamber Players, we're going to be doing sort of a version of that, again, telling that story, but also including the influence of the Native American music on Antonin Dvorak, and we'll have a Native American flutist performing too. So that'll be really interesting.
I love that story. That gave me goosebumps. It's so cool when you dig into the history behind musicians, the historic sites, anything really.
Yeah.
And you really learn some of these undiscovered or less than known stories
Yeah.
and the influence that it had on their
Yeah.
music and all the people that heard that. Thank you for
Right.
sharing that. That was great.
And yes, and Antonin Dvorak wrote an article in Harper's Magazine where he proclaimed that at the heart, that was one of his jobs. He was supposed to find out what is the heart of American music. So he found that what he proclaimed was that at the heart is the Negro spiritual and the Native American music. And he wrote this article in the same year that in this country there were the most lynchings. So can you imagine the power of that statement in that climate? I just find that terribly inspiring. That was a transformative experience for me to realize that. And I'm still learning from that experience.
Yeah, I love that he still spoke out even when tensions were so high, which I feel like is a message that a lot of people need to hear still. So thanks for sharing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
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 So, Pamela, how do you use stories to teach, mentor, and lead? You've shared a couple examples, but is there anything else you'd like to add?
Um, uh, Probably the one thing that I haven't shared with you is that teaching technique that I use with students that I think is pretty effective. And it's not necessarily stories, although stories are a part of it. But I'll have a student perform a small bit of music, and then I'll have them completely change the character of it. Then I'll have them change it again. So if it's a young student, okay, make this sound mad, make this sound happy, make this sound for a wide variety of things. And then which of those things fit the music and why? And then you start to understand how to get deeper into the music. And then sometimes a student, and this is a very effective technique, I'll have them actually, especially for a student that is playing in a sort of robotic way, I'll have them craft a story, kind of like what we do with topics and tempo, to go along with the soundtrack of their piece. And so always, I have never had this not work. It always works. They always are transformed by this experience because they can bring something. It sort of unlocks the key of expression, musical expression. So that's really fun to see for me when
Yeah,
that
and
happens.
for any musical teachers out there listening, I'm sure most of you know this already, but I think the most important ingredient, other than obviously technique, like that matters, but putting your emotions into your music. Otherwise, what's the point? I can't play piano or any music without being extremely emotional, right? Whatever I'm feeling is going to come right out. If I'm really sad, as soon as I start playing, I'm going to be crying. If I'm really angry, that's going to come out on the piano. So teaching students that at such a young age, especially when they don't know how to express their emotions, like I think this was also in the Fred Rogers documentary, Mr. Rogers documentary, where
I
he,
love that. That was
yeah,
incredible. I love that. Really resonated with me.
yeah,
Yeah.
where he goes to the piano and he's like, I mean, I'm really angry. And he gets on the piano and he's like really beating it out on the piano. And he's like, yeah, we have feelings. We get angry. We get sad. And there are safe ways to express that. And one of those ways is music. So
Yeah,
love that.
absolutely.
All right, Pamela, we're going to move into the lightning round. So, what's your favorite book?
The Phantom Toll Booth.
Oh my God. I love that you just said that. I didn't read the book, but I grew
What?
up watching. I know I need to read the book. Oh, that's such a great reminder. The Phantom Toll Booth, I grew up with the movie, and
I've never seen the movie.
you have to watch the movie.
Okay,
It's
I didn't know there was one.
amazing. But now I'm
Okay,
going to read the book. So that's so awesome. I love that.
yeah.
What networking or community group do you love most?
I don't really do a lot of that, but I would say La Miranda Presents.
Love them too. They're amazing. What's the best piece of advice that you could share with others today?
Um, don't wait to find a meaningful path and never settle for less than what you imagine.
I love that. That's great advice. And if you could share one message with the world, what would that be?
Um, I guess the COVID has really taught us this in a really focused way. I think it takes more than just being nice to contribute to society. We all need to be active and tenacious and participate in creating our world.
I love that too. Let's create a better world.
Yeah,
And my last question, what's the legacy that you wish to leave behind?
I found that really challenging to think about. Again, it's like success. I don't really think about legacy, but I guess I would like to leave behind the idea that I might be a creator of community through creative experiences and the joy of learning.
I love that. I also think you're leaving behind really creative ways to help young people through music and make better musicians.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you for that.
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer. Pamela, this has been really fun, really amazing. For listeners, you will have a link in the show notes to the YouTube video when it's ready. I will also have in the show notes a couple links to Pamela's website, as well as her Immersive Experiences page as well. So you can learn more about the company where we've heard lots of stories around those immersive experiences and you can participate in those. Additionally, I'll have a link to the Gold Coast Chambers Players Facebook site. So you can check all those out and learn more about Pamela and connect with her through those three modes. Thank you so much, Pamela.
Thanks, Holly. It was really fun talking with you.
Absolutely. It was a blast. I feel like we should get together for coffee after this.
Oh, I'd love that. That'd be great. That'd be
And for
great.
all of our listeners on the show, thank you so much. We hope that you were inspired. We hope that you walked away with some good advice. And we will see you on the next show. Thank you for joining the show today. I hope you were inspired. More importantly, I hope you take action. What is one thing you can do in this moment that will inspire someone? Without action, nothing changes. Be the change you wish to see in the world. If this show truly inspired you, we ask that you share it through your network. Help us spread the light and inspiration in the world. I look forward to seeing you here next week.